What you're seeing right now is a demonstration on a graph of the gross morphology change of the hominid brain over the millions of years that we have evolved. Now, as human beings first evolved, and if Sahelanthropus tichathenses is in fact our most distant relative, the human brain flatlined for nearly 4 million years. It didn't get beyond about 350 cc's, 500 cc's, somewhere around in there. However, around the time that we see the cladogenesis of humans dividing into many groups, also being displayed in this particular soundbite, when that cladogenesis takes place, we also begin to see the first stirrings of evolution of the brain in a greater direction. The reasons for these things are not fully known, but we can speculate on them because there are environmental and morphological differences that take place at this time that did not happen in the previous years. First of all, we see the beginning of the receding of the forests in the savanna. Secondly, it's more than likely true that humans began living in larger, more complex groups. Now, as also displayed in the study below, once again, I know you won't read it, but I'm putting it there anyway, along with all the sources for everything else I'm using. There was a study done on macaques in the UK that showed that in larger groups, macaques had more gray matter and larger brains. The reason for this appears to be that as we evolved and began living in larger and more complex groups, we needed a brain that was able to accommodate all the information coming in. Primate groups are extremely complex. They're extremely dynamic. In other words, you have to be able to remember not only who are your friends and your family and your relatives, but who your enemies are. Who are people that have helped you in the past? Who have people that have been friendly to you? Who have been people that have actually defended you, for instance? These are all things that take place in primate groups. The larger the group starts to get, the more brain power you need to function. Now, natural selection is going to start favoring someone with a larger brain, and that appears to be exactly what happened. To top it all off, we have the condition of the humans beginning to evolve something like speech. Now, once again, speech and language is piggybacked onto the old emotional primate call system. Warnock's region, the gyruses, all these things are connected to that old primate emotional call system. They seem to evolve in conjunction with the communication apparatus that eventually gives us language, also increasing the size of the brain. Humans slowly start to become more complex, and their brains got bigger as a result. But there's something that happens here that needs to be acknowledged. Nothing in biology makes sense unless in light of evolution. And there are trade-offs to everything an organism does. When you start to evolve a larger brain, you need to make up for the energy expenditure that goes along with it. In other words, you got to figure out a way to start fueling that brain. Humans turn to one of the more available food sources at this point, and it is not a coincidence, in my opinion, or in the opinion of other anthropologists, that we begin also to see the increase in brain size around the same time that the savanna began to be created in a huge expanse, and a massive cladogenesis explosion of bovids on the plains. It probably started out simple. Hominids scavenging animal bodies. That increased brain size needed caloric intake to operate. In fact, even today at a resting rate, humans expend about 25% of all the calories they take in during the day just running the functions of the brain. As the brain gets bigger, it needs more calories. Humans learn to exploit different resources as a result of this. It wasn't just going to be meat. It was always going to be an omnivorous diet. They learned to become effective hunters. They learned to work in teams and coordinate. We see chimpanzees do this all the time. They learned to make tools. This goes as far back as Homo habilis with the Otto von choppers. All this requires an increased size of brain, which also requires an increased caloric intake to run that brain. But meat is probably one of the best things any animal can consume for energy. It doesn't take much to digest. It doesn't take much even to process. It's relatively easy to chew, and even if it's fairly stringy or tough, it can be pulverized, it can be chewed up, it can be cut with tools. The amount of effort it takes to get an animal kill is much reduced as it takes to go foraging every day. The result being that they probably began to have an excess of energy. Evolution responded again. Humans were able to process things a lot easier with their guts in terms of meat. That's why the gastrointestinal tract began to reduce in size. The reduction in size, as you can see from the rib cage of the humans that are in modern times, and there'll be pictures of this up on this video too, the reducing of the rib cage and of the gut not only reduced in size, but it reduced in the amount of energy it needed to process energy in and of itself. Everything is energy exchange, folks. Everything. The reduction of the gut frees up more energy. Guess where that energy can be devoted to? The two most important areas for humans, reproduction and to the brain. Those resources are now redistributed to the brain and to reproductive. This is extraordinarily important. And guess what happens with the increased size of the brain? More functional ability. The toolkit slowly begins to become more and more complex. And this is probably where we begin to see language evolve. Not just as a way of replacing grooming, because these groups were becoming too big in size to simply begin allo-grooming as a means of maintaining bonds, but language. Language is different. Language, you can tell somebody that was an excellent job, and it does the same thing as grooming. It also has another very practical, very interesting side effect: transmission of cultural knowledge. This is probably when we begin to see the first passing on of knowledge from one group to another in terms of tool use. This is how humans evolved. But the one thing that you nitwits can't get around is that humans evolved in this milieu of culture, in this environment, in this kind of situation as a uniform stretch. In other words, they were all facing the same kinds of pressures. They needed to find food, they needed to maintain their group dynamics, they needed to maintain their tools and their culture. They did this by slowly but surely evolving a larger brain. And that larger brain, once it crosses over the 1000 cc threshold, becomes an incredibly important tool in our arsenal. It's when we start to evolve culturally as opposed to evolutionarily. We still evolve slightly, and that will always be a process. But there are plenty of examples of animals who have changed very little, sometimes over hundreds of millions of years. The velvet worm is a good example of that. Examples of the velvet worm far back as 500 million years. It's changed very little. It's a very effective little critter. The result is that it doesn't need to change very much. The coelacanth is another example of that. It's not exactly the same coelacanth that we see in the fossil record, but it has changed relatively little. There are plenty of examples of evolution stalling out or stopping, or proceeding in a very, very slight manner. Humans are a good example of that once we become modern. Now, to move on to this idea that colder, higher altitude climates create smarter individuals, there's a problem with that. Because none of you fuckers understand ecology. If you did, you wouldn't make these stupid statements. Let me tell you about the jungle environment now. First of all, you're not just facing an environment that is incredibly hostile from other animals and perhaps other humans. You're facing an environment that can be just as big a wasteland as a desert, believe it or not. We tend to think of this place as a massive area of biomass, but it really isn't. There might be massive biomass in terms of insects. You might have smaller vertebrates running around, primates, something like that. But large mammals are few and far between. They have to spread out over a massive landscape to find food at appropriate times. In addition, fruit trees don't fruit all year round. Different trees will be fruiting at different times. You're going to have to be there when that happens to exploit this. And this is where the human condition of gaining weight comes in. Believe it or not, we gain weight very easily for a reason. Evolutionarily speaking, it was a huge boon for us because we could pack on pounds in times of plenty, so when times of famine came around, we had a fat reserve to operate on. And this is one of the reasons that humans have such a problem with weight these days. Back then it was very important. We see a similar thing happen with orangutans during something called fruit masting, when all the fruit trees, out of coincidence, mast at the same time, and they literally eat to the point where they get really fat. Of course, this follows by a time of famine. Extracting nutrients from the environment in that fashion is incredibly difficult. It's one of the things that makes the Maya so impressive. They built a civilization more sophisticated than many civilizations in the history of the planet out of this incredibly hostile forest, this incredibly hostile rainforest, with very little in the way of good agricultural land until they created it using Swidden technology, which is just slash and burn. This is the kind of stuff they were able to do. Consequently, on the Serengeti, without any kind of draft animals to chase down fast-moving prey, you have to evolve a different strategy. You know what the Kung do? They actually run animals to death. It's very effective. But in that time of plenty, the Kung San have to exploit that resource very, very quickly because there will be times when it is very, very lean. And they have to evolve strategies in those environments to take care of those lean times. This was true of all hominids, and it was particularly true of Homo sapiens sapien. We all faced these pressures. That's why we became so good at exploiting different resources in different environments. But we're generalists. We're omnivores. Our brain evolved as a template to be able to do that. It makes good evolutionary sense to have a big brain that operates in relatively the same way across the board so that you can adapt to those different situations. It is incredibly important to be able to change your behavior with changing seasons and changing climate. Without it, humans wouldn't be able to spread to the four corners of the world like we did. In fact, it is our sheer range and our ability, no matter what, to evolve to different climates that proves that the human brain is actually a template capable of operating the same way no matter where it's at. You want evidence of this, you've got it. The only reason you Fruit Loops can't accept it is for some strange reason you think that you need to be better than somebody else based on nothing than your skin color. Well, I got news for you, numbskulls. It doesn't work that way. You have to prove yourselves the same way as any of the rest of us do. And that's why I'm getting sick and tired of being called an egalitarian. No, we believe in a meritocracy, you assholes, meaning that the quality of the individual through their education, their upbringing, and their personal abilities gets them where they go in life. You jackoffs want to be handed things based on your goddamn skin color. It doesn't work that way. That is the coward's way out of the useless, the idiotic, the selfish, and the frankly just plain old-fashioned mean-spirited regardless of what color you are. I don't care if you're fucking from Tasmania. This is a cop-out, and it's bullshit. And you assholes have perfected the art of basically theft for things you didn't earn to a goddamn science. You don't like the fact that people have degrees? That's because you can't get one. You claim to be self-educated, fringe elements. Guess what? Fire your fucking teacher.